Let me begin by welcoming you all to this exciting conversation on shifting power dynamics within philanthropy. I'm Dominic Bond. I'm the head of practice for education and philanthropy here at Oxford HR. And I'm delighted to be joined by three expert panel members for today's discussion. In just a moment, I will invite them to introduce themselves. I thought I'd begin by letting you know that we are recording today's conversation and we'll share the link following the session. So you'll be able to revisit this conversation if you wish, and please do share it on to others who might not have been able to attend live and in person. I have some very helpful colleagues who are managing the chat and the Q&A functions for us today. So please do feel free to engage there, share your thoughts, your comments, your reflections, and also bring out any questions that you'd like me to put to the panel on your behalf. I thought I'd begin with just a quick reflection on this topic and also the wider context of the week-long Knowledge Festival that we're part of. And this is, for me, one of the things I value most about working here at Oxford HR. These sessions are not designed to promote our services or to sell you anything at all. Rather, they're a way for us to harness the power of our network and our profile to platform important conversations for the sector. So when I was given a complete blank sheet of paper today to host a conversation for this year's Knowledge Festival, it felt a real opportunity to step into this discussion around power and the shifting dynamics of power within the philanthropy sector. And those of you who are listening closely will be picking up on some seismic shifts in power within the wider charitable sector. And so I'm arriving today with a question around what is already shifting within the embedded power dynamics of philanthropy and what still needs to shift further to help our transition toward a more equitable and just world, what Charles Eisenstein optimistically refers to as the more beautiful world our hearts know is possible. Philanthropy has great potential to take risk and to be catalytic in building movements and supporting meaningful societal change. And so today, I hope that we'll be able to examine some practical ways in which this is happening and also explore what more could be done to both broaden and deepen this work for ever greater impact. I'd like to invite our esteemed panel members to introduce themselves and perhaps share a little about how their work intersects with this topic. Before doing so, I should mention that Shikha is joining us from a conference where she's attending today, and so she did warn us that her Wi-Fi might be patchy. She may have dropped off. If she has, she'll be rejoining just as soon as she can. So let's begin. I can see Caroline and Fozia are still here, so maybe you'd like to just offer us a brief introduction to yourselves and your intersection with this topic. Over to you, Caroline.
Hi, great to be with you. I'm Caroline Fiennes and I run Giving Evidence, and we work with donors and funders of many descriptions and on many topics. And our work is about helping them to achieve more by understanding and using the relevant evidence. And that means evidence about where a problem is, why it is, who else is doing what about it, and what works, so what is effective against those issues, and what the affected communities and intended beneficiaries think about it. So our work is very much about shifting power. It's about shifting power away from what people sometimes call hippos and zebras. Zebras are people with zero experience, but really opinionated. And hippos are the highest paid person's opinion in the room, and much more towards what actually the data show, what really is the case and reality. I grew up as a physicist, and so I'm very much an empiricist about understanding, how the world really is, not just how we kind of sort of think it is on a casual look. And it's also, like I said, a very important component, and part of the relevant evidence is what the affected communities think and what they prioritize. So it is no good coming in with a really effective irrigation program into a village in Kenya if that problem, they don't have that problem, and what they really want, what the community really wants, is for someone to sort out corruption in the police, for example, or they want the bus to come more frequently. So it's super important to understand what to do a good needs assessment, basically, and involve the affected people in that, and for them to have power in what is delivered and how it is delivered and by whom it is delivered. So we are about putting power to the intended beneficiary and also power to the grantee. We run the research for the foundation practice rating, which assesses 100 foundations every year on their practices on diversity, accountability, and transparency. And that is very clearly an initiative to encourage more diversity and accountability and transparency in foundations, which is very related to this issue about power.
Thank you. It will be great to hear more about that initiative. I've no doubt that there will be data points we can relate to through the conversation, Caroline. Fozia, please.
Hi, everyone. So my name's Fozia. I am currently Director of Impact at BBC Children in Need. Prior to that, I was actually a Chief Exec of a very small community foundation based in Luton in Bedfordshire in the UK. So I've had experience at the extreme ends of giving and philanthropy in terms of a very small place-based community foundation and then a huge institution like the BBC. So I'm really interested in how you can translate some of the principles that you want to embed in relation to shifting power in a very small contained community foundation, translating that to a huge public institution such as the BBC, and whether or not you can still abide by those principles. I've also completed a Churchill Fellowship where I was particularly focused on how you use philanthropy for social change. And as a result of that, I published a report earlier this year called Transformative Philanthropy. And that pulls out what I think are the key ingredients which I saw on my travels to the US, working with some of the most amazing funders interested in social change, but from a very community-centric point of view.
Fozia, thank you. And yes, that transformative philanthropy piece, fascinating read, highly recommended, and we will be sure to share links for everybody's work in the follow-up to this session. Shikha, coming to you, I think your connection had dropped off when I mentioned that you might be having some Wi-Fi challenges, so I've already let people know, but it's great that you are back in the room with us. I hope you can stay in the room, and please, just a brief introduction to you, your work, and how you intersect with this question of power in philanthropy.
So thank you, and first of all, apologies for the bad connection. I'm at a forum for investing, which seems pretty pertinent topic we are talking about today. My name is Shikha, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer at Vitol Foundation, which is a corporate foundation of a company called Vitol. This question of shifting power is quite pertinent for us as a foundation, because we are a small team based in London whose work is in the global south. So how do we really put into practice the principles of shifting power? What does it look like? What do we mean by it? Can we fully do it? How do we hold ourselves accountable to it? How can we be transparent in our approach? So I think there are a lot of questions here that are very, very applicable to a foundation like us, who are based in the global north, where the money comes from the global north and it's going to the global south. So it's very, very applicable to us. And before this role, I was at a couple of other family offices at Umidiyar Network, which is the family office of the founder of eBay. And then before that, at the Children's Investment Fund Foundation in London. So very, very close to this topic, have tried and tested a few things, failed many times, I'll be very honest and transparent, but still trying. So love to hear other people's views on this topic and really keen to get into the conversation.
Wonderful, thank you. And thank you to all for so generously giving your time to be here with us today. I alluded to this in my opening that I'd like to begin with a broad question, and I hope that we can then pick up on some of the emerging threads through the rest of the conversation. So quite simply, my opening question to each of you in turn is that we have seen a lot of shifts in power dynamics in the philanthropy sector in the last few years. I'd be grateful if you could briefly share where you feel the most positive progress lies to date, and also from your perspective, what are the most pressing priorities for change? I'm going to reverse the order this time and take advantage of your connection, Shikha. So coming to you first, if I may, some reflections from you on that. I appreciate it's a broad question. Take it in the direction you wish.
No, absolutely. So yeah, there are quite a few to be proud of, and I think that we can take pride in. I think the first one is there is a huge amount of that is being passed on to the next generation that is more conscious about the issues that we face as the world, and also who are keener actually to put their money aligned with. I think close to 30 are going to the next generation as we speak. We're going to be more in the coming years. It's a great thing that is going into the hands of people who are conscious about the values and the issues that we face as a world. I think in the last few years, and these may come across as buzzwords, some of these things that I'm going to talk about, but it's great that there's conversation happening, because conversation will lead to action. I'm an optimist, so things like trust-based philanthropy, and we all talk about it in different ways, and it means different things to different people, but at least people are talking about it, which it never was the case. We never had these kind of webinars before, Dom. So it's like people, and with so many people attending it, it's a testament that people care about it and are talking about it. Things about localization and we didn't talk about it before, of moving teams to where the money is going, being more proximate to the issues. If you can't be, then what are you doing about it? And what are the ways you are making sure that voice of the people you want to serve is included or is the key in decision making? Challenging donor and beneficiary relationships never was talked about before. We have grantees on boards of foundations now, and are making decisions. So again, a good step, or a step in the right direction. And then I think lastly, I would say from a positive shift perspective is talking about systems change. It's not about one investment making, it's about systemic change, where a group of organizations or your actions changing or having a lasting impact on the system again. So all things in the right direction. So I'm really pleased about that, and something that, as I said, that we all should be proud about. Our work's not done. If anything, it's far from done. These things are being talked about, but lots more to be done on these things, especially on practice. As I said, maybe chat at the moment and buzzwords, but happen in practice, and what works and doesn't work, and people openly talking about it, and sharing their failures and successes. Then focusing on collective action and not solo initiatives. So it's again, it's not one organization's work. It's what are we doing and how are we solving things. It's also about challenging status quo. So as I said, our work is done. Far from it. It's like, how are we challenging status quo? And then finally, I think it's embracing or long-termism, if that's a word, and not short-term thinking. So a lot still needs to be done, but those are some of the negative things or pressing priorities, I would say, from my perspective.
Shikha, thank you for those reflections. Lots of resonant topics there that I'm sure we will come back to. Let me offer the same question to you, Fozia. I'd love to hear where you feel this most progress has been made and what still needs to shift.
Thank you so much. I think obviously everybody's interested in the question of power, and I think Caroline hopefully is going to talk about what we mean when we're talking about power, the power to do what exactly. So I'm not going to talk about that, but what I'm interested in is when we talk about power or the ability to do something, that obviously is incredibly important in philanthropy and normally refers to the power to make decisions. What I think has shifted is the transparency about the exercise of power, which has shifted from 10 years ago. So 10 years ago, your foundations pretty much were a secret, insular world where, you know, you never knew quite why decisions were made. There was very little scrutiny. There was very little accountability of that exercise of power. And so I think for me, things such as the foundation practice rating in the UK, 360 giving, where we now list lots of trusts and foundations list their grants, has allowed us to now question that exercise of power, which I think is the important conversation, because power itself, as we all know, is neither intrinsically good or bad. It's, you know, about how you use it and what principles you're using to exercise that power. So we have greater accountability and we have greater scrutiny, which I think is incredibly helpful. And for me, that has mobilized significant change within the foundation sector or philanthropy, which I have never seen before. So scrutiny and accountability is something which motivates behavior within the sector. So we have seen now trusts and foundations take things like their demographic data in relation to where their grants are going, diversity, equity, inclusion, systemic issues. All of these things have come from greater scrutiny and greater conversation about what trusts and foundations are doing. I think there's still a long way to go. You know, there's still many trusts and foundations who work in an incredibly secretive way. So I think I'm really interested in the exercise of power. I think the other thing which I'm really fascinated by is about how you use power to bring about social change. Now, we traditionally think of philanthropy as holding that space. You know, we've got the funding, we've been giving grants for years and years, and you know, we say that we're tackling the biggest issues of the day: inequality, poverty, you know, the climate justice issue. All of these things are the ones where we claim that we are exercising our power for the public good. The thing that I think we all need to ponder on is over the last 10 years or so, the greatest societal shifts have occurred because of social movements. So Black Lives Matter, climate justice, Me Too, you know, these are examples of social movements which have catalyzed change, and these have all been seeded within communities at a local level. So institutional philanthropy and institutional charities have not been there at the beginning of those conversations. We have not seeded that social change, which we say we're experts in. So there's a question about actually how is power to shift society now emerging? Where is it coming from? And I think, you know, the way that power is shifting now in terms of the power of children and young people, the power of social media, the power of grassroots organizations to galvanize and catalyze across their countries globally in a very quick, agile way. It's that power, I think, is something really important for us as trusts and foundations to explore about how do we actually harness some of that power in what we're doing as well, rather than sticking to our sort of rigid philanthropic models of power and social change.
Fozia, thank you. Yes, that's a fascinating question. I think the role of philanthropy in respect of funding these kind of movements and what that means for the way these movements build and catalyze as well. Caroline, coming to you now for the same question, please.
Yeah, so there are, well, we've got a whole smorgasbord of issues and topics that have been raised, and I'm a bit struggling to know where to start. There are lots of different facets of power in philanthropy/charity, and I think the other two are right, that there's a much greater range of activities and initiatives now to move power. I mean, traditionally, the power all belongs to the small number of individuals who control the resources, who are wealthy individuals, or they are corporations, and they are typically in high-income countries, and they are typically quite wealthy individuals, and they are typically male and typically white. Let's just call that out. So if we looked like 50 years ago, that's what we find now. And they typically, as others have said, operated in quite a secretive kind of way because there was no pressure on them to do anything else. Now there is much more transparency. So Fozia is heavily involved with 360 giving, for example. So I mean, you can argue about whether that's power or not, but it's now much easier to see what many foundations are actually doing. I mean, in this country, as you know, there's no legal requirement for a foundation to disclose even who it gives its money to. And so many foundations and donors of various descriptions have opted to be transparent in that way. Some have opted to include in their decision-making units, their decision-making machinery, a more diverse set of people, which might be diverse in terms of gender or socioeconomic background or color or whatever, on backgrounds. And that is great. Again, you can argue whether that's really giving away power. Some involve in their decision-making units people from the communities who they are trying to support. And that, I would argue, kind of is giving away or including in the power machine people from those communities. So that is kind of progress. But nonetheless, there is still masses more that can be done. So there's a big range. So like I say, we run the research for the foundation practice rating, and I dare say that we'll return to this topic a bit during the course of this conversation. And we're currently on our 4th year round. So we've now done 400 analyses of foundations. It's not 400 foundations because some come up more than one year, but anyway, but it's about 280 foundations that we've analysed in total. And there's an enormous range of how advanced foundations are on their practices on these 3 issues: diversity, accountability, and transparency. So at one end, we see a foundation like the Blagrave Trust, where under its former director, Joe Wells, took giant strides in becoming more progressive. And they work to support young people, and they include young people in their decision-making machinery, which was not easy to do at all, and who are very transparent about everything and da, da, da. And then on the other hand, when we look at every year, when we look at 100 foundations, we find about a dozen of them don't have websites and don't even have email addresses. So they report literally nothing publicly other than the few requirements of the regulator. And so, like every political report, much done, much more to be done. I would say. The other thing that happens over time is that there come to be more data. So, our world is about data and evidence. It becomes over time easier to find out, not trivial, but easier to find out what communities want and what they prioritize. So, for instance, Afrobarometer is an organization which does basically surveys and polling in many countries in Africa. And this doesn't solve all the problems, and I completely feel what Shikha was talking about, and that we run foundations for some clients, and it can be very difficult on a very practical basis to figure out what communities in low-income countries prioritize. It can to do that in a cost-effective way. It can be prohibitive, actually. But organizations like Afrobarometer are really helpful in providing some of those data about what people in different countries think is important. And by the way, it's really important for philanthropy to support and to fund organizations like that producing those kinds of data. The growth that you've seen in independently produced impact evaluations, both in the UK and in other countries, is very impressive growth. Masses and masses of unanswered questions remain. But again, it ceases to be the case, like, year on year, it ceases to be so defensible to just make your grant decisions based on what you reckon happens to work, because the available impact evaluations about what actually works becomes a bigger pool, and so the knowledge advances. That's what I would say.
As you say, there's so many directions this conversation could go. I think a question that's come up, or a topic that's come up, I think from all three of you, is this question of representation of affected communities in decision-making forums. And I'd be interested to hear a little more of anybody's practical experience of how that has been enacted well. Is it about having representatives of those communities on decision-making boards? I've heard suggestions of grantees being on decision-making boards, peer organizations then recommending who should be funded. I'd love to hear some thoughts from you as panel members of the perhaps tension that exists there in releasing control and therefore releasing power, about how a foundation or philanthropy might spend its money, and also the imperative to best respond to need and include the voices and perspectives of affected populations. I invite any of you to come in with anything that you think could be helpful practically.
Well, I don't mind starting. I think when it comes particularly to representation, it's, quite often we can be quite black and white in terms of either it's full representation or nothing. And what I found in practice is that there's a spectrum along which foundations are traveling. And that spectrum may include at the start just consultation, so speaking to communities, taking their views into account, but not including those communities in decision making, or or shifting power in a real sense. And then quite often what tends to happen is sometimes you may get a focus group of lived experience people from the community who may form a particular decision-making committee in relation to a particular project or an initiative. And then you've got at the other end boards who are fully signed up to representation. Needs to start from the top, and we need a representation in terms of how the organisation is run and who holds power within that organisation. And so I would see the work as a spectrum, and different foundations are at different points along that spectrum. And the thing with philanthropy in the UK and probably globally is that there is no uniformity. Everybody does it in slightly different ways. At the Community Foundation, we were very quickly able to convince our trustees that we wanted to delegate all grant-making decisions to the communities. And it sounds wonderful. Give all the decision-making power to them and let them decide. But it's not as easy as it sounds, because there are really interesting dynamics whenever you start talking about money. And people have really interesting relationships with money, which I think you actually need to delve into deeper before you start this process. And what you may not have factored in is that, for example, if we're working in relation to a fund for children and young people, and we've given over decision-making power to youth organisations within that particular vicinity, as well, from an ideological perspective, it sounds great, but those organisations are working in a forum of scarcity. Their whole, fundraising team and focus is on raising funding to do what they need to do, and we've created this sort of a competition for funds. So what happens when you put people who are in competition for funds in that decision-making situation? It's quite complex, and it needs to be really, really well thought out before you just jump into this type of work.
Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
and just adding on to what Fozia was saying, it's also, even within those communities, there are power, like, it's not that those communities are free from power structures. So if you are doing a program with the youth and you're only to male members, that doesn't solve the problem. Or if you are doing a women's related and children, sometimes the decision makers within those, there are power structures within those that you need to be mindful of. As you were saying, competing for scarce resources, that how does that really work? So I think it's important to understand that, are your actions leading to organizations competing for scarce resources? Will it generate within or between organizations? Will it democratize funding in some sense? Or will it perversely concentrate power as well? Because even delegating power can lead to that. So as for us, like, we are trying it out, is like focusing on widespread funding, into dynamics, and supporting some of that as a part of it. Also thinking about it, going back to shifting power, we do unrestricted funding. So it's not about a project funding. So we give money as a part of the budget. So let the organization decide where is it that they want to put money into. We are not the ones to say this should not go to employee engagement and this should go to like X, Y, Z. So it's a step in that direction. We will fund convenings to for organizations to learn from each other. So it's really taking, like, understanding your role, which is about providing the funds and not decisions. In some sense, as a philanthropy, that's important. And then taking a step back and letting the organization decide for itself or what it needs. So that's a little as well.
Yeah, I think that's interesting that you raise about restrictions and unrestrictions. So when I was thinking about this session over the last few days, just became clear to me that we're talking about several different types of power, and there are a lot of different types of initiatives. And as you know, I put together a table, which is on Giving Evidence's website now, just a table of different types of power and different initiatives that are trying to address it. So 360 is part of the constellation, 360 Giving is part of the constellation of initiatives to shift power. So is the foundation practice rating. So is unrestricted giving. So are cash transfers to individuals, but they're all getting at different angles. And I just thought it might be useful to kind of split those out. There's a quote that I really often have in my mind when I'm thinking about this, which came from a review, I think in Alliance magazine, of a book about the Gates Foundation, which was about 7 or 8 years ago. It was definitely pre-COVID. And at the time, I think I'm right in saying that the Gates Foundation had the biggest foundation the world has ever seen, has 3 or possibly 4 trustees. You know, when the Gates Foundation was set up, the trustees were Bill Gates, his dad, and his wife. And then I think Warren Buffett joined them, and it might have been written at that time. They broadened it out since. The father has died, obviously, and there are other changes in the family. But this quote from this book review was that, quote, the rich are giving away their money, but they're not giving away any of their power. And it really stuck with me because I guess I see people doing that a lot. It's quite, quote unquote, obvious how to give away your money. I mean, I wrote a whole book about how to do it well because people often don't do it very well. But as Aristotle said, like, to give away money is within any man's power or something, but to give it well is, I can't remember exactly, but to give it well is very difficult. So I wrote a whole book about that. It's quite obvious how to kind of give away money, at least in some sense. But giving away power is a much less intuitive thing to do. And you will often hear people saying, oh, but we're giving away money. Surely that's a good thing to do. You know, and it is a good thing to do, but it's also important to not be completely patrician about it. And Fozia mentioned the social movements, which come very much from the bottom up, and those are all about empowerment and respect and rights and equality for people. So it's important that we do our philanthropy in a way like that. We also just will do it better. I mean, I'm not joking when I say that a good needs assessment is at the beginning of any program by a philanthropic foundation or by an operating NGO. And a good needs assessment absolutely involves talking to the community and understanding what they want and what they are finding. And also they will understand a lot about how things work in their corner of the world, and which will help to design programs that are really effective.
Thank you. Yes, I feel like there's probably different directions that we could go from here, but this whole question of, it's very complicated, clearly, how to involve others in decision-making structures and share the power of decision-making when there are inherent power structures within the communities into which philanthropies are giving, and the sort of challenges they are seeking to solve. I'm curious also about the question of philanthropies having similar agendas and the scope for collaboration, and is that a way to relinquish some of this holding on to power? Is it about pooled funding? Is it, there are examples of some philanthropists gifting all of their money to another foundation, and in doing so gifting the decision making and the power in that way. Is there something to explore about how within philanthropy, how philanthropies can better coordinate, collaborate, and share power and devolve power in that way?
I think there can be. I mean, they're slightly unrelated issues. Collaboration can be a very good thing because obviously it can bring down costs. When we were talking earlier in this session about one of the practical difficulties about finding out what communities, especially that are a long way from you or who might be hard to reach, it can be expensive to go consult with them and find out what they want. And precisely because they're hard to reach is that their voices are not in newspapers and they're not on Twitter all the time and whatever. And so if you have funders collaborating, then obviously you can get economies of scale. So if I think about co-impact, for example, which is sort of a pooled fund, it's a collaboration of various large donors. I think they are amazing in how they do their philanthropy. Is super thoughtful, and they run a very open and thorough process for finding great organizations, and partly they can do that because they're deploying enough money to make it worthwhile doing that, whereas some of their individual, I mean, some of their donors are, the Skoll Foundation and Rockefeller and so on, who can and do it themselves. But there are some individuals who are giving in a pretty large scale, for whom it might not be economic to do, or they might not want to do it for privacy reasons. They might not want to develop a staff, and they might not want to be as out there. So sometimes I think you can get a kind of an economy of scale that can be really beneficial and can enable more voice from the target communities.
Can I just add to that? And this comes back to Caroline's point about the relationship between power and money. So I've been convening funders for years and years, and it's all been very pleasant and very productive and very constructive. Recently, I convened funders for a specific funding collaboration. So it's about people putting money in. And the dynamics that I saw in putting that funding collaboration together were really eye-opening for me, because I'd been convening funders for many years and hadn't seen those dynamics. But as soon as you put money into the equation, it was really startling to me how things shifted. And it really manifested the underlying ethos of that trust and foundation, because they can say one thing, but actually what happens in practice is very, very different. I really believe that funders should be collaborating more. I think it's essential. I think you know, the scale of the issues that face us are just increasing exponentially. The crises, you know, different crises, whether it's in relation to poverty or mental health or inequality, no single funder can address each of those issues by themselves. So in my mind, we have to collaborate, and Children in Need is just starting this journey where we're actually proactively putting a funding collaboration together with other major funders to look at pooling our resources to tackle child poverty at a national scale. But the interesting thing about that is, yes, the money, it will be substantial funding, but what we're also recognising and what we're also expecting from our funders is for them to be using all of their assets, whether it's their platform, whether it's their ability to convene, whether it's their offices in London, whatever else it is. And I think quite often we fail to recognise the other forms of power that we hold, or the other assets that we hold, that we can also bring to the table. And if we collaborate as funders, we amplify the impact that we would have as individuals. And I keep talking about Darren Walker at the Ford Foundation, saying that one of the biggest barriers to collaboration so far has been egos, logos, and silos. Within the funding world, because historically, because philanthropy quite often was connected to an individual or a family, attribution was really important. This is my poverty project, which has been really successful. But I think what I've seen recently, we are moving away towards greater collaboration just because of the scale of the issues that we're dealing with.
Thank you. Shikha, I don't know if you wanted to.
No, I think a lot has been said by both Caroline and Fozia, and I think just to add to that, I completely, fully agree. Collaboration amongst funders is important. Having that vision of what we're trying to achieve as an ecosystem is important, and at the same time, I do think not all funds, because then it leads to just herd mentality of funding a particular type. So letting different pool funds are very, very important, and they have a very important role to play. As long as we have a shared understanding, some of those individual philanthropies doing, they need what they think is the right vision is important as well, so that we are in different ways, failing, learning, and moving on in some sense as well, which doesn't lead to all funding into the same types of organizations, which is also happens quite a lot in philanthropy. Very soon organizations become donor darlings and become much bigger than the others, and many are left behind. So very much agree on the collaboration piece, the importance of pooled funds, and also the importance of individuals trying to do different things and ways of getting to that shared vision.
Thank you. I feel like there's a theme that's come through a couple of times in things that you've said, Shikha, that I relates to one of the questions that's come up in the chat, certainly in my mind at least. And you've mentioned, you know, philanthropy has successes and it has failures. And, you know, I have a kind of question. I see an encouragement by many philanthropies toward their grantees to share and own their failures. And oftentimes when I see these initiatives coming from philanthropy, the same with funding for kind of more authentically led and governed, locally led and governed organizations in the communities that they serve, I feel like at the same time a mirror needs to be held up back to the philanthropy itself, asking exactly those same questions of philanthropy. And let me come back to this question of sort of failure and accountability. There's a question in the chat from Claire about asking, what does accountability mean in your organizations? And what I'm adding to that is this question of, is it also being as frank about what doesn't work and where a philanthropy has failed, as to transparency of how it funds, how it makes decisions? So I guess perhaps this is one you might all wish to comment on, but in your experience, what does accountability really look like within a foundational philanthropy?
I guess I can start with that. It's a question that I'm playing with, to be honest. So I do not have any answer. That I would love to learn more. As I said, I had been in my introduction. So accountability should be at all levels, right? Like, how do we choose sectors that we want to work in? How do we choose 2 areas that we want to work in? How do we make projects get funded or not? Around if something's working or not, double on it or not? How do we make decisions on collaborating with others or not? And then what is the impact that we are collecting or holding ourselves accountable to, and publishing and being transparent around where we are on those things. So I don't think we do, from my perspective, as the foundation I work in, we are not there yet at all. So we are not transparent about these things at all for a variety of different reasons, which you can hold up probably as excuses. About transparency in making sure that how we're making decisions, and how are we holding ourselves accountable and being transparent on where we are on those accountability measures, which is very.
So for the foundation practice rating, we had to come up with, it was a very interesting exercise. We had to take these 3 domains of accountability, transparency, and diversity, and come up with a list of things that one might observe in the published materials by a foundation, on which we could pretty mechanically score 100 foundations. And each foundation we assess, each researcher gets 90 minutes to assess each foundation. We have about 90 criteria, 90 questions. And so it was quite an interesting exercise, taking these little big abstract concepts and turning them literally into a tick list. Somebody said at one point, this is not a tick box exercise. I was like, it's literally a tick box exercise. But the trick is just to make sure that you've got the right boxes. And so you asked, what does accountability mean in a foundation? And we think about this a lot. We have come up with a list of criteria, literally a list of criteria on which we score these foundations. And I don't know that we are completely right about it. So I'm very, very open to other people's thoughts about this now or at any point. So they are things like, it's different from transparency. It's different from just telling somebody what you've done. I mean, Kevin Starr, who runs the Malago Foundation, who's brilliant, he's a medical doctor, among other things, had a letter in The Economist recently saying, isn't it kind of amazing that nobody who has a job like him running a foundation ever gets fired for not having enough impact? And that is what it means to be accountable, is if you have to explain yourself in public, out to your stakeholders, and you can be potentially fired or removed or somehow other, punished. I don't really know of any foundation that has a proper mechanism for that. There are some things like City Bridge Foundation, which was for 800 years old, and for most of which it was called City Bridge Trust. They have their decision-making meetings in public, which is because they are attached to a local authority. That's extremely unusual. Giving Evidence did a little study of how many foundations and charities have meetings which anybody can observe. The answer, you'll be amazed to know, is very few. We also looked at that for operational charities. So that is I would say it's a transparency mechanism. It's not really accountability if you can't ask questions. Global Giving UK, I don't know if they still do, they used to have an AGM every year, obviously, at an open meeting at which anybody can go. It was basically an Ask Me Anything. It was like an AMA, an Ask Me Anything, but it was in person. It was a meeting and anybody could go. And people did, and that was a great accountability mechanism, because then you could stand up and you could say, I am from Bedfordshire. How come you never found anything in Bedfordshire? You know, how do you explain yourself? That it didn't, you know, relate to anybody's compensation or whether they could get kicked out of their job or whatever. But it's much greater progress towards the path of accountability than you see with most foundations. So anyway, I'm very open to other people's thoughts about what accountability really looks like.
Thank you, Caroline. I've got there's more questions coming through from our colleagues in the virtual room, so I'm going to pick another to offer to you, and this goes back to a point you were making earlier, Fozia, about how it's social movements that catalyze change, and what is philanthropy's role in relation to those social movements. And so the question comes from Martin: do any of the panelists have an idea they have tested, or one they haven't but want to, which they think can help them be at the beginning of a change-making movement?
Interestingly, we're at the beginning of that process. So recognizing that how you build up movements is by building power and agency within communities, first of all. So we're looking at a child poverty initiative, which I talked about funding in 10 areas. The funding, I think, actually is the least interesting thing about that initiative. The aim of that initiative is to start a national conversation about child poverty and how it is unacceptable that one of the richest countries in the world has this level of child poverty. That is the aim. So it's not about grant funding. It's not about giving some project cost to an organisation and you know, keeping the lights on in you know, that sort of immediate response way. The ultimate aim is about changing the national conversation and counteracting narratives about child poverty and amplifying the voices of communities impacted by poverty to enable them to influence and build social movements. And so what we're doing is, one strand is the grant funding, which will be 10 areas across the UK, community-led solutions as to the impact of poverty in their area. The second aspect is bringing those 10 areas together as a funder, convening them, supporting them, facilitating them to build a community of practice and to provide that peer support to each other, which is so important in building a movement, so that they create a really strong network between them, which you know, supports itself. And building evidence within that as to what's working, and also the challenges, what's not working. And then the third element is enabling that community to then have the platforms and the capacity and the skills needed to talk about the impact of child poverty on them and their families. So what you're doing is you're layering up an approach. You're starting at grassroots level, you're giving agency and you're giving power to people to change the circumstances around them, but then you're lifting that to the regional and then to the national level. And that's how I think philanthropy can play a role in enabling movements. I think, you know, we are in such a privileged position where, you know, we're not accountable to shareholders or to the local authority. We have great autonomy generally and agency. And I think starting or experimenting with some of these more complex ways of investing in communities is something that only philanthropy can do. It's not something local authorities or the public sector have the capacity and the resources to do. So we'll see. It may not work, and I'll be sure to come back and tell the story if it doesn't.
Thank you so much. That's very exciting to hear about, and an initiative to watch closely. Caroline, Shikha, anything that you would also offer in this context of, you know, philanthropy maybe slightly changing the way that it operates to better support these emerging movements, societal movements?
You know, my only thought is about how difficult it can be on a practical level for donors to engage and to find these organizations and support them. So some of the most flexible money in the world just belongs to wealthy individuals. There's no structure, there's no committee meeting, they don't have to wait for the quarterly blah-de-blah meeting, they just do whatever. Some of those people want to be quiet and not flashy and not really known. And that's not because they're, they've got anything to hide, they just don't want to be the story. And there's a very practical issue about how they are supposed to how they can find these opportunities where that flexible, fast money can be fantastically valuable. I don't know whether the answer is to kind of be pals with people like Fozia who are sort of plugged in from an institutional basis. But I'm very aware of that kind of complete disconnect between supply and demand, you could call it, or between where money is and where it is most needed. And it's a very sort of mechanical disconnect. But if you're running Me Too, like, you don't know about like a bunch of hedge fund managers that you can, or whoever that you can write to. Like, how are you supposed to discover these people, and vice versa? So maybe sometimes collaboratives that we talked about before can be part of the answer, because then there can be staff members and those economies of scale. That's my thought.
Yes, thank you. That question of access, visibility, and how those emerging movement builders can actually, they're not likely to be professional fundraisers as well as movement builders. So how can philanthropy best find and serve them, I guess, is that question. I recognize that we've just a few minutes left. There is and I might be opening a too big a topic at the close of a conversation, but I also noticed, Caroline, you talk about diversity as being an aspect that you measure, and I think, Fozia, I've heard you speak to the comparative absence of diversity and representation and proximity amongst philanthropy leadership within the wider charitable sector. Shikha, I had the privilege of working on the hiring process that resulted in you joining the Vitol Foundation, and I cite it when I talk to clients as being one of the most exciting processes I've had the chance to work on, because we were given the remit to appoint literally anyone from anywhere in the world. It was quite unique. There was support for relocation to London. There was support for work permits and visas as required. I'm curious, in the couple of minutes we've got left, where do you feel that the barriers and opportunities lie, particularly to increase the diversity, representation, proximity of philanthropy leadership? Are there particular initiatives, particular barriers that you think need to be overcome?
I can give it a go a little bit. I think one is a role going to be located. So, for example, for us, it was still a role that had to be based in London, because the corporate is based in London. They have a small team that's based in London for the foundation that's based in London. So it's the nuance of where is the role located, and if it is located in the global north, are they open, as you were talking about, to sponsoring visas and other things for whoever for the proximate leader to be relocated, which is not ideal, but are there then mechanisms for those things? And both those things many times they just become hindrances. Goes back to a little bit on the trust as well. If you are, and I think Fozia talked about it, if you are ready to give your money away, give your power away too, because and let the role be located in whichever location you're trying to serve. So we are far away from it, but some of the things would be the location, the logistics that are associated with it, and then also the networks. How are you expanding your networks to reach those people? A lot of times those networks are closed. You only go to people you know, which doesn't solve the purpose at all. So yeah, which is really important.
I'll just add something very briefly onto that, because I know we're out of time. Kai Adams wrote an article recently about fit, and that word fit, that's quite often used when we talk about either trustees, boards, senior recruitment, and he really interrogated what do we mean by fit, and how we discount people through the use of that word. So I just challenge people to think about that a bit more.
We will make sure we look that out as well and add it to our follow-up note to everybody. That sounds a fascinating read. Thank you. Caroline, I don't know if you have a last word on this before I draw us to a close. I'm conscious that we've overstayed our hour.
Just to say, I think a barrier is fear of risk. I think sometimes, you know, let's call them traditional decision-making units, bodies, you all know who I'm talking about, are sometimes fearful about bringing in people who, frankly, look different to them and have different backgrounds. They sometimes perceive that as a risk, or they're fearful of it. And I think that many of my colleagues who come from those, you know, non-traditional backgrounds, let's call them, are doing an astonishing job. I want to call out particularly Safina Ahmed at John Ellerman Foundation, who I think has said publicly that the trustees, when she was appointed, thought they were taking a bit of a risk, I think.
Yes, she has.
And if I remember that wrong, then I apologize, but I think she said that publicly. And she's playing an absolute blinder at John Ellerman Foundation, I would say, in terms of how it operates, and not being afraid to delve into its past and look at the where the money came from and all the related issues, and being very effective and getting systematic feedback from their grantees, and publishing it all of it, warts and all, and publishing what they're going to do about it. And so that the risk of recruiting people in one's own image is people don't think about it enough. The risk is that you just kind of staying doing the same things. As we know, diverse teams typically perform much better. And so the risk is the other way around.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. An inspiring example to end on there. Caroline, thank you so much. I feel like we could have talked for a lot longer. There's a lot of ground that we didn't get into. I really appreciate your time today, our three panelists, and also everybody who took the time to join us for this conversation. I mentioned this is a week-long event. There is one more session happening tomorrow. My colleague Rachel Barlow will be talking about the implications of the new EU legislature for non-profits. So if that's relevant to any of our audience today, please do check back in tomorrow. Just let me close with my deep appreciation for the work that you do, Caroline, Fozia, Shikha, and for giving up your time today to really allow us to explore some of these dynamics. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.